everybody. This is Christine back for Pep Talk Podcast, and I am so excited to be here to introduce Beck. And we are here for April, which is Autism Awareness Month. But 10 years ago, I actually made a documentary with families that are touched by autism. And something that I said as kind of like the tagline of the movie was awareness is a step, but acceptance is the destination. And in reflecting on that recently, I was like, it's been 10 years. I don't know that we're any closer to acceptance than we were 10 years ago. And so part of this Autism Awareness Month that I really want to be leaning into is actually amplifying autistic voices and advocating for autistic acceptance. So with that said, from me, and Beck, please take it away. Why don't you just tell us about yourself? How did you come to be diagnosed? That would really be a wonderful thing. But first, just start with you as a person. Who are you and how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I was just teaching remotely on Google Classroom all day, but we have a teaching artist, so it was actually fabulous and refreshing. And normally at the end of the day, I'd be totally wiped out. But when we have Inti on Mondays, it's really wonderful. He's a spoken word artist, a poet, and a rapper, and he's just so great with the kids. Yeah, so I am finishing up my master's degree right now. This is my final semester, getting my master's degree in 7th through 12th grade English education, and I'm working with all ninth grade English students right now. And we have a mixture in every one of our classes of just general education kids, as well as students with disabilities and English language learners.
Wow.
Yeah, so
that is a lot of different attention spans and levels of need in terms of like the demands placed on you as the teacher, I would imagine.
Yeah, so it's fabulous because there's a ninth grade ELA team. So we meet a couple times a week, and the lead teacher who's like mentoring me right now as I finish my master's degree, kind of like leads where we want the units to go as far as content. And then we have specialists who specialize in helping modify and accommodate IEPs and disabilities in the classroom. And then also specialists who they do TESOL, which is like for English language learners, and how to access English language content, either by figuring out ways to modify it or translate it into a home language. And the TESOL teachers actually get the English language learners for one special period every day where they just provide support for all the other subjects. So it's great. It's cool. It's been great working in this school, and I've been having a really great time getting to meet these kids. And I'm really excited because finally, after 3.5 years of doing this degree part-time, I'll actually have my own classroom for the first time starting in September. But right now I'm not actually a lead teacher. I'm a student teacher, which is basically just like co-teacher, but without getting paid.
Oh man. Wow. Well, congratulations. That's amazing. What school is this? I feel like this is the most comprehensive learning plan I've ever heard of.
This is the High School for Law and Public Service. It's one of the 3 high schools that's contained on the George Washington campus in Manhattan. So it used to be this massive, massive school with like 2,000 children enrolled in it. And at a certain point in history, I say history, but it was like the 90s and we were alive then. But for the Gen Z kids, New York City decided to start breaking up these like massive schools that weren't really serving their student populations. So often in these really big, very old school buildings that were built in like the late 19th, early 20th century, you'll find that there are multiple high schools in there. You could have 3, 4, 5 high schools all in one building. So we're one of 3, and we have like the whole 4th floor of the school. And there's a little over 400 kids enrolled, and we're concurrently teaching them in person and online. So it's chaotic. This has been a big learning year. This is not how I imagined I would be ending my master's degree, but I'm learning a lot of new skills with different online teaching platforms.
For sure. Oh my gosh. And I think, I love that you highlight what it has been like for teachers and how mentally and emotionally draining it must be to be able to do all things for all people in that forum. And I think, teachers do not get enough credit for that, especially with the pandemic and everyone's stresses being so high of like what is safe, what isn't safe. So I commend you and your school for just doing such comprehensive work for their students. That is beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. And, it's their right. Like these students have a right to the services that they're being given. It's not special treatment, it's equitable access to education. So,
Oh,
um,
amen. My gosh.
yeah. So, I guess that kind of circles it back to me. So,
Yeah.
I'm an autistic person who grew up not knowing that she was autistic. Um, my sibling, I have three younger siblings, but the sibling who's closest in age to me is named Hannah. And they were like just very obviously autistic their whole life since they were a toddler. It was very clear with kind of like echolalic repetition of phrases and knock knock jokes and like funny things that she would do, and also like with her emotional meltdowns. Um, so I always knew I had this autistic sibling, but she didn't get her official diagnosis until she was an adult. I think she was like 26 when she finally got it.
Wow.
And the reason that happened is because I had a parent, a father, who was very against accommodation for disabled people that he thought could basically mask and perform as neurotypical, and that it would have spoiled Hannah rotten if she had gotten disability accommodations, and like that the label would do more harm than good. So that all comes out of a very ableist perspective, and is very harmful, because even though Hannah was never put into any kind of like ABA therapy or anything like that, my father would still verbally abusively reprimand Hannah for obviously autistic behaviors all the time. So there was still kind of that like beat the autism out of the child thing going on in my home. I have a very different personality than Hannah. Hannah is the center of attention. She's loud, she's funny, she's like just ridiculously, incredibly, terrifyingly brilliant. um and like i I'm really kind of a quiet, shy person. You will often find me like in the corner reading a book, or like in the corner with an animal. Like I'm a big animal person. If there's an animal at a party, I'm like more likely to be playing with your dog than like speaking to other people. So it was like with someone in the house whom I love dearly. I'm not blaming her for nobody noticing. But with somebody who was just so obviously autistic, I think it was really easy for my family to just kind of not notice me, because I was quiet and I got pretty good grades. I was very obedient. I was a big rule follower. Anytime there's like some kind of explicitly stated rule, you better believe I followed it. So I had no idea. And I only knew about autism kind of in like the stereotypical Hollywood portrayals of it, which is generally white, cis hetero men. The famous one is Rain Man. Everybody knows that portrayal.
Mm.
Or, they never explicitly say it on The Big Bang Theory, but like people often think of like Sheldon Cooper, or like The Good Doctor is a new show that is
Yeah.
supposed to be a portrayal of autism. And the problem with that being kind of the the extent and limitation of autism representation in art, in TV and film, is that it leaves out all the marginalized genders. So girls and women end up not getting diagnosed. Trans people end up not getting diagnosed, and like under the umbrella of trans non-binary people. And it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that I experienced because the way that I finally found out that I was autistic is Hannah finally got her official diagnosis when she was 26. And then she felt validated to finally like say that that was her identity. Cause like my family would always kind of like talk about it. It was an open like secret, but she didn't really use that in her personal life as like part of her identity. And she didn't really feel that she owned it or claimed it because it wasn't official. It wasn't on a piece of paper. It didn't come from a doctor. So when it was finally hers and like she had claimed it, she started doing all this research and started meeting all these other autistic people online. And if you haven't looked yet, there's a massive, massive autistic community online. So if you think that you might be autistic, go check it out. It's like everywhere. Like every social media platform you can think of, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, they all have autism accounts or autism pages that you can go meet autistic people, read about their experiences. And if you're questioning it already and you start seeing some things that resonate with you, you might want to follow up and see if that could be you. So that's what happened to me. I was sitting in a bar called the $3 Bill. Queer is a $3 bill. And I was at this like cute little queer mixer with Hannah and our other younger sibling, Sam. Everyone in my family is very gay. And so we were just hanging out at this queer mixer, and I did something socially not neurotypical. I cannot remember what the behavior was, but like Hannah clocked a thing and was like, have you ever thought that you might be autistic? And I was like, absolutely not. You know, like I have a math learning disability, for God's sake. Like I've never been interested in NASA. I can barely do 2 + 2. Like,
wow.
you know,
So you were leaning into all of those biases that have been portrayed for us as a society of like, if you have autism, you must be this.
exactly.
Yeah.
And like, especially because I knew Hannah was autistic, and like she's a poet and an artist and a comedian, but like she's good and always has been good at math and science. So it just made sense to me that she was, because she had the big brain, you know. And I, you know, I have dyscalculia, and it's truly like it's embarrassing, but like I can't really do math like at all. And it's hard to even read like a phone number or like memorize dates for history class correctly. So, and like, or reading an analog clock. Oh my God. Like one of the biggest things I need is digital clocks because I can't really tell the time. And I'm a 30-year-old woman.
Yeah.
So I have this learning disability, and like I'm also very femmy, you know, like I'm queer, like I'm bi, but I have like I'm, you know, like a girly girl, and I feel like there's a stereotype of autistic women as tending to kind of eschew that sort of like traditional femininity, like autistic women not really caring about their appearance or fashion or makeup or that kind of thing. Which is a stereotype, by the way. Like that's not true. Like it's cool if you do, like not wearing makeup, wonderful, do you, baby. But like makeup is like such a big thing for me, and it always has been. Like it's something that I have loved since I was really little, like maybe 10. I went to the library, big nerd, got out like a Bobby Brown like makeup textbook and brought it home, and like got out all my mom's makeup that she never uses because she only wears like eyeliner and mascara and nothing else, and like taught myself how to do makeup with a library book. Hint, like number 1000. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that.
so like she's like, you ever think you might be autistic, after I do this thing in a party? And I'm like, no, leading into these stereotypes. And like, I sit on it for 2 weeks. And then I was like, okay, maybe there's some learning and unlearning that I need to do. So, you know, the first places that I really went to were scientific studies about autism in women and something called the female autistic or autism phenotype. And I started reading about the way that autism presents in cis women specifically, and how it can be very different than the way autism presents in cis men and boys. And the key word that kept coming up, a behavior called masking, or in British UK literature, it would be called camouflaging. And basically what that means is you kind of become a social chameleon, and you pick up the sort of like social scripting and social behaviors of neurotypical people around you and adopt them to pass as neurotypical. So that's something that I had been doing my whole life that I didn't really have a word to describe. I had no idea, but is absolutely something that I do and have done. And it's helped me be very successful in my life, but it also has made my life feel that it lacks authenticity quite a lot. It takes a huge toll, especially when like honesty and personal authenticity and being true to yourself is a big part of who you are, which it is for me. Feeling like you have to kind of put on this face to get through, like to survive in society and like do well in school and at work, it's really hard and it's exhausting, and then you end up spending a lot of time just sort of recovering from having done that all day.
Yeah.
And so like since I got my autism diagnosis and since I learned that word masking, I do try to unmask a little bit more now, but it's also such an ingrained behavior, because I've experienced so much stuff from before I really like knew how to mask that made it important for me to mask. So, you know, I was living in this house where I was observing Hannah basically having the autism beaten out of her. So anything that I perceived that might get me in that same kind of situation, I learned how to suppress. Um, so Hannah never really managed to suppress meltdowns. I learned at a very young age how to cry completely silently. Like no sobbing chest noises, no sniffling, just like if I had to cry, like the tears would come down my face and I would hold my body completely still and just like basically like quietly almost hyperventilate. Um, so there's a huge intersection between, you know, trauma and autism for me here. But you know, thinking back, like I can think of a time that I had what is clearly now looking at it a meltdown, and like how badly it went for me. And I basically ended up getting physically dragged by my parents into the car to go when I didn't want to, and I couldn't really articulate a logical reason to them, and I wasn't physically sick, like I didn't have a fever, I wasn't puking, so I needed to go.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter how I felt or what was happening or the fact that I was having what is an autistic meltdown. And so I literally was just like physically, as like a probably around 10-year-old child, like put in the car and buckled in and forced to go on with life, even though what I really needed was cool down time and love and support, but that's not what I
Yeah.
got. So if you spend, you know, so many years of your life in survival mode, you eventually kind of explode. And that's what happened to me. I started having 7 to 8 panic attacks a day. And I had to go to therapy and get medication. And I basically asked my therapist, you know, why is it that like a panic attack or a meltdown was something that would happen once, maybe twice a year, and like otherwise I was extremely successful, had excellent grades, you know, held down multiple jobs, you know, like why is it that I could live my whole life up
Yeah.
until 27 years old, and then all of a sudden I have like my body and brain have ceased to function and I cannot do my job, and I won't be able to keep my job unless I can stop my body from doing this thing that I cannot control. Panic attacks are terrible.
Yeah.
She was basically like survival, like the your body and your brain can do some amazing things for you if you need to get through something. But the second that you're safe, you're going to pay for all of those years. So what happened is when I finally got to the place where I was safe, like I was doing well, I had finally completely broken off my relationship with my abusive father. My mother was finally separated from him. My family was healing. I had a good job. I have a wonderful spouse. And we had been married for a little less than 2 years, I think, at that point. And I was just like in this place that was great. And then my body was like, right? That's what happens. So unfortunately, sometimes it can be hard for me to unpick what is a sensory processing difference that I have because I'm an autistic person, and what is a complex post-traumatic stress disorder response that I have from being psychologically abused on the daily for 18 years and then semi-regularly until I was about 26 when I finally severed the ties. So when you start looking at this stuff, you can unpick some of it, and I've been able to kind of figure out, what's like a sensory trigger and what's an emotion trigger, but sometimes they are so commingled. Like if you're having a really bad emotional day and you're already anxious or depressed or both, and then some really horrible sudden loud noise happens, like the reason the sensory trigger is so bad is because there's already emotional stuff going on. So it can be hard when you have comorbidities and you're like multiply disabled, which I am. I'm kind of like a lot of acronyms in the trench coat because I have PTSD and I'm an ADHDer and I'm autistic. And I also have some physical disabilities too. So like my life is messy, but it's good. And I just want to be hopeful. Like to anybody that's listening to this that thinks, oh my God, like this kind of sounds like something I relate to. Like I'm okay. Like medication and therapy saved my life, and my relationships with my friends and my spouse and my cat, who I love so much, like they give my life so much meaning, even though I deal with a lot of kind of ugly moments or ugly days or even ugly weeks.
For me, it was resonating so deeply because I also have complex PTSD. So for me, it was coming from a place of such deep, yes, I see you, I hear you, like that has also been my experience. But I hope that it didn't read as like, oh, that was insensitive, damn. Like, so I just wanted to say that to you, that like, it is incredible how when we remove the stigma from different things in our lives and make things that society deems taboo and shameful, and we just take those labels away and say, I am allowed to talk about the things that are happening for me, because when I don't talk about it, it makes it that much worse and that much harder. We can suddenly feel like we have the capacity to breathe. And I think that is so important. And so often people feel shame about things that were perpetrated against them or done to them, or were completely out of their control in the way that they grew up, or the list goes on and on and on, by the way that people receive or internalize trauma. And I think so often there is this judgment related to trauma of like, well, how did you get traumatized? Your family was loving and your this was that, and everything was stable, and you don't understand trauma. And it's like, well, sometimes trauma is lots of tiny little T's built up on top of each other that pile up to be too much for me to handle. And it's not to say that you couldn't handle it or the next person couldn't handle it. It's just too much for me to handle. And between my little T's and my big T's in my life, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate you being so candid in everything that you talked about, from your journey, the process of unmasking, because something that like we are socialized to believe is like, oh no, girls are like sugar and spice and everything nice, was like an old nursery rhyme, and girls have to do this and girls have to be this, and you're seen not heard, and all of these things that we are brought up as, like how proper and prim we have to be, and demure, and be demure but not too demure, and be passive but don't be a doormat. Like there's all these dissonant messages that are received from such a young age that sometimes people don't even realize that they are communicating those messages, but we as people internalize them. And so it's just such an interesting thing, because I think that makes the masking that happens for autistic women and girls that much more of a stranglehold. It feels like, I don't know, just in listening to it, that's what coming up for me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I was raised in like a very insular religious community of Southern Baptists who had a very specific idea of what femininity is and what it means. And there was a huge emphasis on purity culture and modesty, humility, servitude, and you know, I think in the right framework, some of those things can be probably quite wonderful, but when they're used to oppress people, it can do a lot of damage. And so my body and my behavior as a girl was policed and honestly very creepily sexualized from a very young age, because a lot of what goes into the whole purity culture thing is like the idea that you are preserving yourself for your future husband and that he will be the only person who ever has any access to your sexuality when you're a grown woman. And also there's a slightly disturbing element that like your father is like the caretaker of your sexuality and purity until he hands you off to that man who is your husband.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've
So
never heard that before. So yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, Southern Baptists are like a very fundamentalist denomination of Protestantism.
Mm.
And you know, like there are definitely even further fundamentalist and more intense sects of Christianity, but Southern Baptist Christianity is to this day one of the most homophobic denominations of Christianity, and the most deeply embracing of gendered norms and gender roles that are taught straight from the pulpit to the congregation.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's there's a lot going on there for gender and gender expectations and like what that was supposed to look like, and how watching my mother also kind of being pushed into that box, because she did not grow up Southern Baptist. She converted right before she got married and then raised her children in that life, but it wasn't who she grew up to be. So she kind of like made herself this very small version of herself that wasn't in any way genuine, but that was what femininity was modeled as to me. And modeling for children, like anybody who knows anything about child development will tell you, like that's a big part of how you craft your identity as a small
Yeah.
person, as
Yeah.
what the grown-ups in your life are doing. And you know, she was completely under the thumb of the church and my father and this ideology of gender. And yeah, it absolutely contributed to the particular way that I masked and mask. I have a very polite refined, delicate, and demure mask, but it's really not who I am.
Yeah. And I think something that's so interesting about everything that you were saying, and I mean, that I work for the church, so I am a youth minister. I work with teenagers, and something that I always try to be very cognizant of is that I cannot put people before God, and I cannot put God before people. It has to be a continuum. It has to be a relationship between the two, because each person holds divinity and each person holds humanity. So there is both frailty and honor in each person. And so I think what's so important about that is to kind of examine and challenge people to examine in their faith, what does it mean for you? What does it mean in your own life? How does that play out? How do these lessons challenge you? And if they do challenge you, why? Let's have conversations about it. Because I have heard so many people talk about the damaging teachings of the church. And I think sometimes it's just not shared in a way that creates space for interiority, that creates space for the development of one's own morality. And that creates space for like personal development, to even understand, like, why is this being taught? What does this mean? Is this serving me or not? Like, if this is more damaging than good, should I be subscribing to this ideology, or do I need to take a step back? And like, all of that evaluation, I think for me personally in my faith journey, and again, only speaking for myself, has been so important, because there have been things that I'm like, this is deeply troubling or challenging or frustrating, related to like whatever it may be about the church. But I find that I am able to prayerfully discern for myself in a way that isn't ultimately damaging myself, and I hope that it's not damaging for other people. So I'm just so sorry that that was your experience, that that was your mom's experience. And it's not to be condemning one type of religious group or uplifting a different type of religious group, but that must have been so difficult. And you're definitely not the first person that I have heard talk about like how claustrophobic they became because of their religious upbringing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, um it sparked several years of inquiry after I got out. When I was just before I turned 18, I moved in with my grandparents on Long Island. I grew up in San Diego, and I started attending college, and it was the first time in my life that I wasn't literally required to be in that environment at a minimum of like 3 times a week for, Bible studies and clubs and worship services. My life was completely steeped in it. So it was the first time I had a chance to step back from it and ask myself, what do I really believe in? What do I really value? Who am I without this? And the answer for me is a secular humanist. Quite frankly, Christianity no longer has any place in my life, but I do still have friends that are deeply, deeply faithful. Not just you, Christine, but one of my best friends ever, Erica Davis, is a deeply faithful woman. And so, I have room in my life for people of all beliefs, but for me, it was very important to step away from it completely and to remove it from my life. It just doesn't have a place for me. I personally cannot reconcile my feminism and my queerness with the text that is the center of Christianity. And I know that that's personal to me. And if you are able to figure out how to make feminism and faith and queerness work for you, I know that there are, feminist lesbians that go to church every Sunday. And if that works for you, I'm not saying that like it shouldn't or you're doing anything wrong, but
yeah.
it doesn't for me. So just if anybody is out there who is questioning, you know, that for themselves, just know that there is life after church if that's what you need to do.
Yeah. And I think what's so important, and certainly what I hope to model, and encourage, anyone that is on the podcast with me to model, is the ability to respect each other, even at times of differing life experiences, difference of opinion, difference of whatever it may be. Because you're not trying to talk me out of the church, and I'm not trying to talk you into the church, and we can still coexist. And I think that's so, so important.
A lot of autistic people, the puzzle piece doesn't feel representative of their experience, because it wasn't created by autistic people. It was created by neurotypical people. And as a symbol, it's very loaded. It can make people feel like they're being seen as though there's a missing puzzle piece to who they are, like a cure to autism would like click in like a puzzle piece and suddenly make them fully human or more acceptable, or that the missing puzzle piece is like what makes, humans functional in a society. Like there's just so much weight behind that particular symbol. But when autistic people were thinking about what they would prefer to use as a symbol, the most common one that I see usually is a rainbow infinity symbol, which I think is pretty cool. I've also seen it in gold. I've heard some autistic people talking about using like an octopus, which is like an extremely brilliant, interesting animal, and either making like a gold or a rainbow octopus as like a neurodivergent symbol. But
Wow.
the most important thing is whatever the symbol is that it's made by a neurodivergent person representing other neurodivergent people. And none of us can speak for all of us, like I'm one person, but the thing is, we do belong to a special subgroup of society and of people. And so like, just like there's, a gay pride flag, and then there's all the sub flags of, a bi pride,
Yeah.
trans pride, etc. Like that's how I see it. Is like, so maybe like our version of our kind of main flag is that rainbow infinity symbol, and then there might be some other interesting like sub symbols that come out of it.
I love that.
But yeah, look for that, because there's also a big association between the puzzle piece and a group called Autism Speaks, who has historically not been respectful of autistic people's voices, hasn't typically included them on their board of directors, and has perpetuated some fairly harmful stereotypes and types of therapy that are more harmful than helpful to neurodivergent people. So neurodiversity isn't just autism. Other people are neurodiverse, ADHD people are neurodiverse, and there's a huge overlap. Like if you're autistic, you should probably check because you might also be ADHD. Like it's one of those things that there's like a massive overlap. But basically, the question that you should ask yourself when you're supporting something is, are there autistic people involved here? Look at the board of directors. Is anybody autistic? Look at who's writing the articles for their website. Is anybody there autistic? Who made that symbol? And the phrase that I'm going to say is pretty old. It's been used by disability advocates for many, many, many years, but it's nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us, ever. You don't get to talk over us. You don't get to talk about us. Well over half of us are able to express ourselves either in written communication or with augmented or alternative communication or verbally. So you got to listen up, because like way more than half of us have something to say, and we can say it clearly. So it's time for you to listen to those of us who are actually autistic.
So I just have one more question for you. What would you say to parents, siblings, advocates, educators, all of the people out there that are very well intentioned, but feel like, well, that's very good for you, Beck. And you said your experience is your experience, but what about my child or my sibling or my student that is not having an easy go of life because of autism from their point of view? Like autism has made them struggle. What would your response be to those people? Because inevitably people will watch this episode and will feel very strongly in defense of their child or loved one because of the stance that you just took, which, by the way, I support what you just said wholeheartedly. And in my own growing and learning, I am trying to be more understanding of the way that I have advocated in the past is not always the best way. The way that I have thought of person-centered speech and this thing is uplifting the person and celebrating the ability is not the disability, but it's also reductive. And so it's important to listen to people that are actually autistic, as you said. But what about for those people that can't voice for themselves and their family members that are just trying to do their best to be advocates for the voiceless? What would you say to them?
Well, one thing I would say is that we're learning more and more every day that people who are non-speaking, or you may hear the term nonverbal, may actually be able to express a lot more than we had formerly thought that they could if they were given proper access to and training for use of AAC equipment. So that's one thing. That's a major problem.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is that, like, I realize that I'm a bit of an outlier with how verbal I am, like oral verbal communication as an autistic person. Most autistic people, even if they can speak, because like there's all kinds of different disabilities that you can have with like oral dyspraxia and stuff like that, that could keep you physically from being able to move your mouth in a way that helps you speak. So I can, and I'm comfortable with it, and I get that, and I'm acknowledging that. However, even if you do have that kind of disability that keeps you from physically being able to make words come out of your mouth, there are so many other ways of communicating and self-advocating, whether that is, using an iPad to talk or another device, or just your behavior. Pay attention to the behavior of the kid that you're talking about and listen to them with your observation. You got to do a little Sherlock Holmes, be a detective, actually check in, figure out why they're doing what they're doing. And don't make any assumptions, really, because quite frankly, they might not be able to talk to you about what it is that they're thinking or feeling, but I guarantee you right now that as an autistic person, my sensory experience of the world is way closer to their experience as a non-speaking person than yours as a neurotypical person is. So that's another reason to listen to autistic people who can communicate fluently, whether that's via writing or speaking orally, is because most of us have some kind of sensory processing difference that shapes the way that like all the input of the world goes into us and how we react to the world. So whether you're speaking or not speaking, that's still such a key part of autism. If you sit back and learn and listen to us when we talk about sensory processing differences and accommodations for that and stimming and all of the other things that go with it, you can learn from speaking autistic people, even if your kid or your loved one is a non-speaking person. And I know that that might be hard to hear because, you have ownership in that relationship. They're your person and I'm nobody. You don't know me from Eve. But if you can take the deep breath and open yourself up and listen I promise you, you will learn something that will make your loved one's life better and easier to live and happier and more comfortable. And that's really what we all want, right? Is more dignity, more happiness.
Yes. And I have to say, I know we have to get going, but I just have to say, I think that it is so important what you just said, that even if their child's experience is different from your experience, listening to you could help them gain insight into their child. So rather than saying, it's a puzzle, it's a mystery, how do I find this out? There are literally people out there that are verbalizing and articulating, this is my experience, this is why I stim, this is why I have meltdowns, this is why my sensories are my sensor oh, my I'm sensory overloaded. And so if people are actually willing to be vulnerable, to put themselves out there, to say these things, why aren't we listening as a community? If we are all one giant wanting autistic rights and dignity and love and acceptance, why aren't we listening to things that could be helping aid all of us? And I thank you, Beck, really so much for being here with us today. Beck is going to be with us for future episodes throughout the month of April as my co-host, and probably my conversationalist extraordinaire, because I'm just going to sit back and go ahead, Beck. But really, thank you so much, and I look forward to our next talk.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. All right, you take care. Bye-bye.